Hey, what's up guys? I bet you don't know what this is gonna be about. Yeah, I know, I'm crazy.
Is it that we collectively thought Steve Jobs was a great man, even when we knew he made billions off the backs of children? Or maybe it's that it feels like all our heroes are counterfeit.
What's up guys? My name is Splice and we are definitely not doing any more of that. If you hadn't noticed, and this is just me coming up into the first season of Mr. Robot being finished, so apologies if I'm not caught up all the way and if there isn't further defined stuff later on. I wanted to talk just briefly about the split personality. Oh, and spoilers by the way. I wanted to talk really briefly about the split personality that Elliot has to deal with in his time as Mr. Robot. So, Mr. Robot is actually introduced to us as a separate character who's drastically different from the Elliot that we're introduced to, who is quiet, sullen, he's a masterful hacker, he's very analytical, he's very much cold and dead emotionally to the world. And then, as a flip side, we have Mr. Robot, who is, as Elliot puts it, straight up crazy. If someone asked him to jump off a bridge, he would, just to make a point. That is how Mr. Robot is physically described, as a person, as an entity, as an attitude. And then, right at the end of the season, right around 8 or 9, the episode, we get this mindfuck element telling us that, oh my god, my dad's not dead, because we'd been told this whole time that his dad is dead. And of course, now we are totally mind blown thinking that, holy shit, his dad's been underground, he suddenly appears out of nowhere. But then, they again take this crazy mindfuck and kind of shatter it again. And this is actually something that's been hinted at heavily since the start, because the person that Elliot, the main character, is talking to is a fictional entity in his own head, which he at least acknowledges in the beginning. Whereas Mr. Robot, we learn later on, who is another figment of his imagination, a projection of his father and the sometimes insane, crazy attitudes that he actually has onto what he's familiar with. Now, that said, it ends up leading him to essentially act out the way that Mr. Robot does in the show, and he's the one who's actually saying and doing a lot of these things, and then it's almost a duality experience that we're not privy to until later on. And then they finally, even though they have interplay of scenes, they show us what it looks like to other people when you realize that he is straight up living two personalities that are drastically different, which are likely brought on actually by the traumatic event of his father's death and him then working in cybersecurity as he does. Now, he's been planning to bring the cybersecurity world to its knees through E-Corp and being destroyed internationally. Now, he later ends up gaining sort of a conscience and understanding that's probably a crazy idea, something he should not do, but he ends up going against this at the end and fucking everything over and destroying everything because, fuck it, we finally have true freedom. We're not locked into the cyber world. And that is kind of the attitude of his alternate personality, the Mr. Robot. The one that he has not, as yet, come to terms with and been able to truly recognize as a part of himself. Why that's really interesting is it's kind of a look into the typical idea, and obviously this is being played up for TV, of a split personality. Now, in psychology, this is actually denoted as a dissociative personality disorder, where you're disassociated from certain personality traits and it ends up almost taking on its own sentience, its own structure based on the things that your original sort of mindset is completely disassociated from. And the idea behind it, even though it was originally coined as multiple personality disorder, it's mostly just emotional traits and attitudes that you do have or you've developed through a traumatic event, which is generally how the multiple personalities manifest, or the dissociative personalities manifest. You either have to push your emotions down, and that ends up sort of coalescing as this alternate personality, which in the case of Elliot, he ends up straight up blacking out when Mr. Robot takes full control. Which is interesting because that does get played up a lot in media again as well, because it's this idea of the different personalities, the driving attitudes taking on a more controlling and pilot behind the scenes role in your life. And that has been documented as people in real life experiencing things like this. So it's interesting to see the way that Mr. Robot plays it out. It is kind of an interesting representation of that illness, and even though it's not initially sort of stated or hinted at, there are indications that he is repressing a lot. Whether that's because he is himself a person who's disinterested in socializing, but he does kind of have the stinted behavior of possibly Aspergian or autistic attitude. It's more likely almost savant level even, because of his incredible capacity for hacking and understanding the ones and zeros of that world, and that generally is something associated with Aspergian or savant individuals. That isn't to say that those savantish traits aren't just a part of him, and then these social attitudes that he either developed or pushed down, and they end up manifesting as a whole nother personality now as Mr. Robot. That is what that's all about. As yet, being that I've only just finished the first season, unfortunately, I know, spoilers, crazy, blah blah, whatever, I'm late as hell to the party. Who knows? He might even develop this, or he might learn to have more control. We do know that he ends up manifesting other personalities in through his mom and his younger self, as well as obviously the audience. The character that he perceives as the audience, which is what he talks to all the time. And it's what gives the monologue and soliloquy heavy narrative a sense of realism, because he's talking to us, but he's also talking to a made-up fictional reality character that he's at least aware of. Whereas with Mr. Robot, for the majority, that fragment of his personality was so sequestered that he didn't even realize it was a fragment of himself. Which is really interesting, because some people don't actually recognize the fragmentation of their own psyche. Now, this can be seen in a couple of different ways, and if you want to actually examine it on yourself or other people, look at the way that people interact around different people. And what I mean by that is, when you're at your job, you act a certain way versus when you're on your own, at home, or when you're with friends. They're generally very different attitudes, whether you're serious and studious at work, flamboyant and crazy when you're out with friends, and quiet and introspective when you're at home. Now, these are all different attitudes that are essentially a part of a greater whole of one's own personality, but they're fragmented experiences that essentially shade different parts of who you are. Now, if something traumatic does happen, what could actually occur is a fragmentation of that concept. So what I'm saying is, if something traumatic happens and it involves, for example, the family life, where you have a certain behavior that you have this expected role that you're hitting, or certain behaviors that are common to those people, you might accidentally manifest those behaviors as a sort of coping mechanism or way to keep that sense of normalcy that has disappeared. It's almost like a coping mechanism to maintain said normalcy, even though that has basically been thrown out the window at this point. So it's interesting to understand it in that regard, but it's also just interesting in general, because when you think about people, you don't always recognize that their opinions and attitudes are subjective, and when a certain subjective part of them is shaken, whether that's a job being lost or something substantially more tragic or traumatizing, like a death that is very close to you. A good example of that would be later in Mr. Robot, when someone kills themselves. It starts to build a dissonance in the female main character, who is kind of the opposite of Elliot. She's emotional, happy. She's very relaxed and definitely taking a larger part in the digital world. However, once this happens and other things that are also piling onto it, but that is definitely the catalyst for what could definitely fragment her personality. She's become very cold, stoic, and almost unfeeling, which is a grand departure from her original character. While that can also be argued as a character development, it can in fact also be seen as a way in which she will end up eventually mirroring the darker, sinister transformation that Elliot has gone through, where he has to deal with Mr. Robot versus himself, even though Mr. Robot is just a manifested version of himself that is more anarchistic than he himself is. So anyway, guys, it's really interesting to talk about these concepts because they're so multi-layered and intricately laid, especially in something like Mr. Robot, where they do a very in-depth cross-examination of the concept. There are some minor sort of things that don't make a lot of sense to support this narrative in the end game, but for the most part it is really solidly done, beautifully executed, and it's an interesting lens into the world of someone experiencing this and not always being aware of that reality, which can indeed be something that happens. So anyway, guys, with that said, thank you so much for hearing my thoughts out. I know I've been kind of rambling a little bit and being a little bit more monotone and I guess more Elliot-y than normal, but that will change in the future, next episode. If you like this, guys, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that notification button, as is always a lovely thing to do, so that you can keep up to date with all the latest videos that I put out, whether it is dealing with CW, with Elliot, or something else in general. It's always fun, good times, and crazy analysis of some kind, whether it is philosophical, psychological, film analysis in general, or something completely different off the wall. You never know what's going to happen next, and that is honestly my favorite part of this sort of reflection. Anyway, guys, thanks so much for watching. My name is Splice Knight, and I will check you guys next time.